Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In today's video I'm going to explain the 8 quotations that I've chosen for the Romeo and Juliet revision song. Now the idea behind the revision song is to help you to memorize the important quotations from a text and to do that through setting it to music. And with Romeo and Juliet I've chosen 8 quotations. You can listen to the song if you click on the screen now. But I'm going to explain why these quotations are important because there's no point in memorizing them if you don't actually understand the significance of them. So they're a little bit out of chronological order, but when it comes to Romeo and Juliet, I feel there are 4 main themes to cover. Obviously, it's a play about love, but there are 2 different types of love that are presented in the play. Juliet seems to have a very realistic view of love. She's very down to earth, whereas Romeo has an unrealistic view of love, with his head in the clouds, often using celestial imagery. Juliet much more rational and realistic, and you could see that as a criticism of courtly love. And Shakespeare himself really believed in love as being kind of a realistic presentation of warts and all love being important, whereas what we see from Romeo is a very kind of immature, unrealistic view of love. So I thought it would be important to pick one quotation which explains this sort of unrealistic, over-exaggerated, celestial imagery view of love that Romeo has, and then another one where Juliet says something very kind of rational and intelligent. And for those 2 quotations, I looked at Act 2, Scene 2, where Romeo says, "It is the east and Juliet is the sun." And this is that kind of overblown, ridiculous language that Juliet, is the sun, the metaphor there. And I do explain all of this in my guide to Romeo and Juliet, or my playlist where there are 51 videos to work through. Juliet, one of her responses is that she is basically shy or worried that Romeo will think she was too easy, too quick to sort of fall in love with him. And she questions that perhaps if thou thinkest I am too quickly won. In other words, well, maybe I should hold off a bit because I don't want you to think I'm kind of cheap and easy to get with you right away. So that's a nice quotation for Juliet in terms of her kind of rationalistic, kind of, realistic view of love. There's a beautiful bit of form analysis in Act 1, Scene 5, where Romeo and Juliet meet. And when you put their words together, their lines together, they actually speak in a perfect sonnet of 14 lines, iambic pentameter, the correct rhyme scheme, etc., etc. I've got a video on it, watch the playlist. And I've just taken the rhyming couplet that comes at the end in the volta of the words they speak together. So Juliet says, "Saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake." And Romeo says, "Then move not while my prayer's effect I take," and he kisses her. So I just think this is a great one to memorize because it is form analysis, and you can write about how Shakespeare presents their words combined in the sonnet form, which many people do not know. And you can talk about how this is a presentation of pure and realistic and sort of heavenly love, the godly religious imagery suggesting that this is, for Romeo, a much more pure and sacred relationship than when he was criticizing Rosaline at the beginning, who wouldn't ope her lap for saint seducing gold. So Romeo was depressed at the beginning that he couldn't get with Rosaline. Now he's with Juliet, but this turn to religious imagery and the use of the sonnet form suggests that this is a perfect love. I also think it's really important to be able to write about the fact that all throughout the play is a very bawdy, crude, rude, sexual sort of humour, and very, very clear that men conquered women, pushing them to the wall, all the rest of it. And there's a quotation which I thought was very shocking from the nurse in Act 1, Scene 3, where she says that when Juliet was a child and fell over, the nurse's husband said to Juliet, "Thou wilt fall backward when thou comest to age." In other words, when you become a bit older, you'll be on your back a lot having sex. And I thought this was a great quotation for if you want to mention the crudity and the kind of bawdy nature of the sexual imagery that we see throughout the play. And of course it contrasts greatly then with the religious imagery in the perfect sonnet form in Act 1, Scene 5. And of course, structurally as well, you can analyze how, this sexual imagery comes in Act 1, Scene 3, which then is a great juxtaposition, a great contrast to the pure imagery of love in Act 1, Scene 5 as well. If you're going to write about conflict and fighting and the kind of feud and everything, a great quotation from Romeo in Act 3, Scene 1, "Gentlemen, for shame, forbear this outrage." In other words, we mustn't be fighting. And this shows the change in Romeo's character, as he now doesn't hate Juliet's family, doesn't hate the Capulets. And if you're writing anything about his character, how he progresses and changes, you can use these quotations to talk about how he fell into that sort of bawdy sexual thing and was enemies with the Capulets, but now has got this pure love, this sacred love, this religious love, and desires not to get involved in conflict. Also really important, and this will help you to hit the context box, are the attitudes to children and parenthood. In Act 1, Scene 2, Paris wants to marry Juliet, and Capulet, Juliet's father, says, she's only 14 years, let 2 more summers with her. In other words, let her, go on for a couple of years, let her get to about 15. She's 13 actually, she's not even 14 years was the quotation. And then in Act 3, Scene 5, we see a dramatic turnaround where Juliet says, I'm not going to marry Paris, thank you, but no thank you. And he calls her green sickness, carrion, baggage. And he says, get you to St. Peter's Church. And the quotation is, or I will drag thee on a hurdle thither. In other words, if you don't, I'll drag you there on a hurdle. Now, a hurdle was a sort of wooden framework which was used to transport traitors. So it's shows the sort of attitudes to parenthood. And of course, you can write about how in Elizabethan England, particularly in middle and upper class families, parents chose who their children married, and how this is a lovely way of getting into context and alternative interpretation, because you can write about how the Elizabethan audience would have seen nothing wrong with that, but today most of us find that shocking, etc., etc. So that's why I thought these 8 quotations were really good, because they seem to cover everything to do with love, both the realistic, the unrealistic, the bawdy sexual to the religious and pure. There's a nice analysis of form, some things you can write about structure when you're looking at how the attitudes change, perhaps from the nurse in Act 1, Scene 3 to Juliet and Romeo in Act 1, Scene 5. And you can talk about contextual attitudes to parenthood, parent-child relationships, etc., etc. So hopefully you can see why these quotations are important. And the next video will be the song. So I know it's not, I'm not going to get a recording contract off of it, but I just want to help you memorize things in a way that's easy to remember.